You think you know history. You think wars are just battles, numbers, treaties, something finished, something behind us. But World War II was never about nations, orders, or peace. It was a mirror held to the species, and you, the listener, are what stared back. Section 1. The numbers lie. You've been taught to trust numbers. You were conditioned from the earliest age to believe that statistics hold truth, that numbers are solid. But let's begin with the first fracture, 50 million. That's the rough body count most historians agree on for World War II. Neat, rounded, comprehensible. But then, dig deeper. The Soviet Union alone claimed to have lost 27 million lives. Not 26.8, not 27.3, just 27. North Korea insists that 30% of its population was wiped out, yet no one can produce accurate birth records from the era. China, where the war began years before 1939, presents conflicting tolls ranging from 10 to 20 million. Each regime had reasons to inflate or deflate numbers. Propaganda, reparations, shamed out. So whose truth are you counting? Historians discovered Nazi reports where trains filled with Jews were never logged as arrivals to camps. Instead, they were documented as cargo expended. Imagine trying to estimate how many lives were lost in incinerators that burned 24 hours a day for months in places like Auschwitz. When even the ovens malfunctioned under the weight of bone, you look at the figure, 6 million Jews. It's clean, horrifying, and finite. But what if it's a partial truth, not in scale, but in understanding? Because numbers are a defense mechanism. A 6-digit death toll is less frightening than the screaming of a single child in a locked train car. And here's where it spirals. How many people died of starvation? In Bengal, in 1943, while part of the British Empire, estimates range from 2 to 3 million, and they are rarely included in World War II death tolls. Why? Because they died without guns, without battles, without headlines. They died of supply chain disruption. They died because Churchill chose to feed British troops. Instead, they died in silence. And silence doesn't count, Dot. Did you know that by 1945, 80% of all men born in the Soviet Union in 1923 were dead? 80%. Entire generations erased before they could reproduce. How many ideas vanished with them? How many families never? Born? What never happened? Because they were never alive to act. And even if we say 50 million, are we counting the suicides that came after? The shell-shocked veterans who jumped from windows? The women who miscarried because of trauma? The children born to rape in occupied zones who never knew who their fathers were? What is the actual number? Do we count the men who returned home and beat their wives for the next 40 years because they couldn't unsee what they saw in the forests of France or the snow of Stalingrad? Do we count the echoes? The emotional chain reactions that ripple into your own family tree? Because that's where this gets uncomfortable. If your grandfather's grandfather came back from Dachau with nightmares and beat his children to cope, and they passed the trauma down like an heirloom, where do you fit in the war's cost? Are you a descendant of the fallen or a collateral wound? You assume the war is over because the treaties are signed and the monuments are quiet. But if the trauma of that war created the conditions that made your parents behave a certain way, and in turn shaped you, is the war really over? Or are you still bleeding from a wound you can't locate? You see, the numbers are tidy, but the reality is still unraveling. Here's a number, 100 milliseconds. That's the average human reaction time. Fast enough to blink, too slow to dodge a bullet. And in the span of World War II, a 6-year blink entire cultures, languages, and bloodlines ended. You are taught the war happened then. But war never ends where the bullets stop. Dot. It ends when the last mind stops suffering. Dot. So here's the question. whispered just before sleep overtakes you. What if the war never actually ended? Because the minds it broke are still alive inside of us? The banality of evil. You want villains. You crave them. Your brain, hardwired for narrative, hunts for a singular face of horror. Hitler, Mussolini, Himmler, Tojo. But behind the speeches, the uniforms, the flags, and the gas chambers lies a deeper, more unsettling truth. Not every killer was a monster. Most were just people. Consider Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution. When Israeli agents abducted him in Argentina and tried him in Jerusalem, the world expected to see a frothing maniac. What they got was a boring bureaucrat, a man who spoke in passive verbs and filled out forms. He didn't scream Sieg Heil. He talked about logistics, quotas, and transit times. When asked if he felt guilt, he said, "My job was to obey orders." That's where the horror metastasizes. The Holocaust was not orchestrated solely by sadists. It was enabled by desk clerks, train operators, engineers, secretaries, people who clocked in, stamped papers, checked boxes, and went home to kiss their children goodnight. You are imagining that you are not like them, that you would have resisted, that you would have spoken up. But psychology says otherwise. In 1961, the same year Eichmann was on trial, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment at Yale. Participants were told to deliver electric shocks to a stranger when they answered questions incorrectly. The stranger screamed, begged, even pretended to die. But the authority figure in a lab coat kept telling them to continue. 0.65% of people went all the way, delivering what they believed to be fatal shocks, simply because they were told to. Now pause. Replace electric shock with gas chamber. Replace authority figure with SS officer. Replace participant with you, still so sure. Milgram concluded, ordinary people simply doing their jobs can become agents in a terrible destructive process. He called it obedience to authority. You call it following orders. This is where reality buckles under the weight of your own delusion. You don't need to be evil to do evil. The Nazis didn't hypnotize Germany. They reflected it. A population frustrated by war reparations, economic collapse, national humiliation, and a slow, creeping normalization of hate. The first anti-Semitic law in Nazi Germany? It wasn't a death order. It was a boycott of Jewish businesses. Just one day, just one sign on a shop. That's how it starts. Not with violence, but with participation. Do you know how the T4 euthanasia program began? The Nazis started euthanizing mentally ill children and adults first in secret, then openly. Why? Because many Germans agreed with the idea. It was efficient, clean, economical. Hospitals became slaughterhouses. Nurses became executioners. Parents were convinced to let go, and none of it required force. Only consent by silence. Now bring this closer. In 2020, over 2/3 of Americans said they would follow government orders even if it meant surveillance, forced lockdowns, or economic shutdown. Not because they're evil, because they're obedient. Because fear reprograms values. And fear is universal. In Rwanda, in 1994, Radio DJs incited genocide. Their voices sounded like entertainment, but they broadcasted kill lists. They said, cut the tall trees. That meant murder the Tutsis. Ordinary men with machetes obeyed. They killed neighbors, children, pregnant women. Why? Because they were told to. Because the voice on the radio sounded like you. Now ask yourself, if you were born in 1920s Berlin, and your friends started joining the party, and the posters looked noble, and your father lost his job because of a Jew, and you just wanted to belong, how long would you resist? If the cost of defiance was your wife's job, Your child's future? Your safety? Would you still say no? Because that's the terrifying thesis. You don't need to be bad to participate in atrocity. You just need to want to be safe, to follow the rules, to trust authority, to belong. No one wakes up and decides to become a cog in a killing machine. They just sign the form. They wear the uniform. They keep their head down. They're told it's for the greater good. They believe it. They become history's silence. So ask yourself, how? Many of your daily choices are just obedience in disguise. The children were watching you imagine war as a battlefield. Guns, tanks, screaming soldiers, flags. But that's just the noise, the theater. The real war burrows in quiet places. Behind doors, beneath tables, inside young skulls. World War II, more than 13 million children were displaced. That's a number you skim past, assuming it means sadness, hunger, or cold. But that's not the point. What does it mean to grow up in a collapsing world? What happens to a human being? Whose first memories are bombs? Let's step inside a single day. It's 1941. You're 6. You're in London. You're eating bread soaked in canned milk while your mother counts ration stamps. Outside, sirens begin. You do not flinch. You are used to this sound. It means the world is about to shake. You run to the underground. You sleep with hundreds of strangers on concrete. The air tastes like sweat and mold. You wake up to silence. You return home to find that the house 2 doors down is now a smoking crater. Your neighbor who once gave you toffee is now a memory. Now stretch that across years. Entire childhoods raised in fear. Formed by it. What does that do to the human brain? Psychologists studying trauma imprinting have found that the earlier a child experiences prolonged terror, the more deeply their nervous system is wired to expect danger. The amygdala, the brain's threat sensor, becomes overactive. Permanently, these children do not heal when peace returns. Peace is now unnatural. Silence is suspicious. Love is distrusted. A hug feels like a prelude to loss. And it wasn't just the Allies. In Hitler Youth camps, children were taught that mercy was weakness, that Jews were subhuman. That betrayal of family in favor of the Reich was honorable. At age 10, they marched. At age 14, they trained with live ammunition. At age 16, they died in combat. Now imagine being told your entire value is as a tool for death. Imagine being applauded for reporting your father for speaking against Hitler. That happened thousands of times. You've heard of the Hitler Youth, but you haven't heard of Wolfschanz, the military indoctrination centers, where kids were brainwashed with games and riddles that glorified murder, where math problems looked like this. If a machine gun fires 550 rounds per minute and kills 11 enemies, how many will it kill in 5 minutes? And these children grew up. They didn't vanish. They married. They became bankers, fathers, neighbors. The man who smiled at you in the grocery store in 1982 could have once sung songs about burning books. And what of the Jewish children, the ones who survived? There's a study done on child survivors of Auschwitz, the ones who were too young to remember their parents' names. Many were adopted after the war, but they didn't speak. Some didn't cry. Some didn't blink. Some, at age 4 or 5, could describe with mechanical clarity how bodies looked stacked in the crematorium. Decades later, psychiatrists found something haunting. These children, now adults, had vastly higher rates of insomnia, cardiac disease, and suicidal ideation, not because of what they saw, but because their brains were built inside horror. There is no before. There is only damage, and it didn't end in 1945. In Unit 731, a Japanese military research division. Chinese children were infected with plague bacteria. Their limbs were frozen to study frostbite, their skin peeled back, their organs removed without anesthesias so doctors could observe death. These were children, your age, once. The doctors didn't stop. They went on to lead medical schools. Some were never punished. Some were recruited by the US military in exchange for their data. The children were tools, sacrifices, experiments. Now, ask yourself, how many medical breakthroughs have roots in torture? How many lives today were saved by data acquired through agony? Are you comfortable knowing that your understanding of hypothermia, altitude sickness, and infectious disease was refined in part by experiments on children in camps? What is the ethical residue of progress built on pain? And if history forgets the child, do we? Here's the final splinter. Psychologists studying intergenerational trauma have found that the stress responses of Holocaust survivors were passed genetically to their children and grandchildren. Methylation markers epigenetic scars found in DNA, which means you can inherit terror. It means that the ghost of a scream from 1944 can live in your blood. You pride yourself on being post-war. But maybe the war didn't end with treaties or ashes. Maybe it is stitched into your cells. Maybe it is dreaming in the fetal curl of every descendant who never knew why they felt afraid. So now we must ask, how do you know your childhood was truly yours and not just a delayed detonation from someone else's war? Science didn't save us. You believe in science. You tell yourself that reason is humanity's great redeemer, the sword that cuts through ignorance and superstition. But during World War II, science did not save us. It devoured us. It began not with bombs, but with ideas. In Germany, the most educated country in Europe, a pseudoscience called eugenics became national policy. It wasn't fringe. It was mainstream, taught in universities, praised in journals, celebrated by intellectuals. Doctors, real ones, with degrees and credentials, measured skulls, drew bloodlines, sterilized women, murdered the mentally ill. Not out of hate, but out of logic. They believed they were optimizing humanity, cleaning the species, repairing the gene pool. They weren't sadists. They were scientific, rational, efficient. The gas chambers were not an act of chaos. They were a calculated mechanism. Cyanide pellets, airflow systems, architecture designed to resemble showers so the victims would walk in willingly. These were engineering solutions to a problem defined by science. Auschwitz had chemical engineers who calibrated how much Zyklon B was needed per cubic meter of human flesh. That's not madness. That's mathematics. And don't look west for moral clarity. The United States sterilized over 60,000 people under its own eugenics programs well into the 1970s. In fact, American eugenicists inspired German ones. Hitler admired the way California was cleaning its race. You're taught to see the Allies as saviors, but war has no clean side. It is a black hole that consumes every light. Consider this. In 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on civilian populations, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 people, most of them non-combatants. The bombings weren't to win the war. Japan was already close to surrender. The motive, partly, was to demonstrate power to the Soviet Union. These bombs weren't dropped by monsters. They were built by geniuses. J. Robert Oppenheimer, when witnessing the first detonation, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But he didn't stop. None of them did. The scientists who built the bomb were not under duress. They were thrilled. It was the greatest experiment in human history. Their life's work validated by a blinding white flash in the desert. Later, the US celebrated them, gave them medals, made them professors, because they didn't murder civilians. They expanded the frontiers of physics, That's science. You want to separate war from knowledge. But the division is false. War funds science. It always has. Radar, penicillin, rocketry, even microwave ovens. Many of the technologies you now use daily were born out of the need to kill faster. And when war ends, the weapons don't vanish. They're domesticated. Werner von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist, whose V-2 missiles rained death on London, was brought to America. He led NASA. Without him, the US might not have reached the moon. But he used slave labor from concentration camps to build his rockets. Thousands died constructing them, collapsed from exhaustion, crushed by falling equipment, beaten for failing quotas. And von Braun? He got a commemorative postage stamp. This is what science becomes in the absence of ethics. The discipline that gave us antibiotics also gave us chemical warfare. The minds that deciphered the atom also divided the world. And now, in your own time, as artificial intelligence begins to replace thought itself, and gene editing becomes child's play in CRISPR labs, you still believe science is neutral. But nothing is neutral in the hands of man. Everything we invent is a reflection of our psyche. And if you were handed unlimited power, the ability to reshape biology, history, time, what would you become? You want to believe that World War II was a breakdown, an anomaly, a time when men went mad and science lost its way. But what if the war wasn't science failing us? What if it was science revealing us? What if the cleanest lab coat hides the dirtiest? Intentions? So now you must ask, if knowledge without morality becomes annihilation, are you still proud of what you know? The silence between photographs. You've seen the images. You think you understand. A girl running from Nepal. A pile of skeletal corpses. A flag raised on a heap of rubble. Black and white proof, printed and archived, made safe by the distance of time. But photographs are not truth. They are fragments. The camera captures a sliver. What it doesn't show is the space just outside the frame, and it is in that silence where the deepest horrors grow. Consider this. For every image of a Holocaust victim being liberated, there are hours of torment with no lens watching. No light, no audience, no memory. A child crying in a cattle car that never makes it into the historical record. A mother scraping at a frost-covered wall in a death camp cell. A hand pressed against a gas chamber door minutes before stillness. Unseen, unrecorded, unacknowledged. That's the terrifying paradox of memory. We preserve what we witness, but atrocity often unfolds in the dark. Historians estimate that over 90% of war crimes committed in rural Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus during the Nazi occupation were never photographed, never documented, never confessed to. Entire villages were erased, burned, and buried, and no one knows their names. Imagine that. Generations who lived and died without ever being seen. In 1942, a group of Jewish prisoners in the Warsaw Ghetto buried a time capsule collection of documents, photos, and letters called the Oyneg Shaves Archive. Why? Because they knew they were going to die. They wanted the future to know what happened. They buried their truth so that someone might one day dig it up and believe them. They knew that if history forgot them, they never existed. Ask yourself, how many screens were swallowed by the earth? How many moments are so saturated with pain they can't even be described? And when a survivor tries, decades later, their voice is fragile. Often, their story sounds unbelievable. Children who watched their families beaten with shovels. Mothers forced to choose which child to save. These stories are not clean. They do not fit Hollywood. They are rejected not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient. So they rot. Like letters never sent. Even when photos do exist, they deceive. a smiling Nazi guard at Auschwitz, a Japanese soldier handing candy to a child in Nanking. You see the image and forget the context. Evil smiles, too, and yet you rely on these photos to believe? Would you believe the Holocaust happened if you had never seen the camps? Would you believe 20,000 people died in one day at Babi Yar if no camera recorded it? Would you believe that? Women were experimented on in Block 10 of Auschwitz if no record survived? Memory is fragile. But worse than forgetting is doubt. Holocaust deniers exist. People who stand before piles of bones and say, "This didn't happen." They publish books. They speak in universities. They wear suits. They sound calm. Because denial wears the mask of reason. Now look in the mirror. What do you deny? What? Facts have you silently discarded because they made you uncomfortable? The bombing of Dresden by the Allies killed tens of thousands of civilians in a firestorm. Entire families incinerated. Flesh melted into pavement. But that's not a war crime because the victors don't prosecute themselves. The images were censored. You don't remember what you never saw. Silence becomes strategy. Now extend this. How many genocides are happening right now? Unseen, unphotographed, unfelt by you. In the silence between your scrolls, in the seconds between your clicks, 1,000 children might starve, a mother might be raped, a village might be razed, but you won't see them die, so you won't remember them. And if they're not remembered, were they ever real to begin with? That is the final collapse of history. We are what we witness. We are who we choose to remember. And we erase everything that makes us uncomfortable. So here's the question you can't escape. If memory is curated, how do you know your entire understanding of the past isn't a lie of omission? The moral mirage were taught that World War II was a war of good versus evil. The Allies versus the Axis. The liberators versus the oppressors. A moral war. A necessary war. But morality is not absolute. It shifts, bends, recoils. And during war, it doesn't die. It gets redefined. Take the word liberator. It conjures images of American troops opening camp gates. British forces freeing French villages. Soviet soldiers rescuing survivors. But ask the women of Berlin in 1945 who were raped, brutalized, humiliated by their so-called saviors. What liberation meant to them. Historians estimate that Soviet troops raped over 2 million women during the occupation of Germany. Girls as young as 8. Grandmothers, nuns, pregnant women. Some were raped dozens of times a day. Suicide became a survival strategy. But the Red Army were victors. They defeated the Nazis. They were on the right side, so the world stayed silent. The same silence cloaked Allied atrocities elsewhere. In 1945, British forces bombed Dresden, a city with no significant military value, knowing it was full of refugees. They used incendiary bombs, designed not just to kill, but to burn. Thousands of civilians, many of them children, were roasted alive in the firestorm. Their bodies fused with asphalt. Their screams never recorded. What made this acceptable? The answer is simple. They won. In war. Victory rewrites virtue. America dropped atomic bombs on cities. Not to stop the war, Japan was already collapsing, but to demonstrate dominance to the Soviets. They chose Hiroshima, a city full of civilians, children walking to school, mothers cooking rice, and vaporized it. 3 days later, they did it again in Nagasaki, not out of necessity, but because they had a second bomb. These were not moral acts. These were calculated spectacles. Yet your textbooks call them decisive, tragic but necessary, the end of the war. They don't say mass immolation of civilians. They don't describe a mother carrying the charred body of her infant as her skin peeled off in sheets. They say peace was achieved But if peace is paved with corpses, what is it really? Now consider the Tokyo fire bombings conducted before Hiroshima. Over 100,000 civilians killed in one night. Incendiaries were used deliberately, knowing Japanese homes were made of wood and paper. Firestorms engulfed neighborhoods. Rivers boiled with floating bodies. Survivors compared the aftermath to Dante's Inferno, and none of it is in your conscience. Because no photo hangs in your classroom. Now look inward. When you feel national pride, what are you proud of? The flag? The soldiers? The victories? Are you proud of the morality of your side? Or are you proud of being on the side that won? This is the moral mirage, the belief that your ancestors fought for good, but good is elastic. During the war, the U.S. government interned 120,000 Japanese American citizens, placing them in camps without trials, without cause. Children behind barbed wire, businesses seized, homes stolen. Why? Because they might be spies. Because fear makes ethics irrelevant. Where was the moral clarity then? And morality failed not just on the battlefields, but in the minds of ordinary people. In France, neighbors turned in Jews, not because they believed in Nazi ideology, but because they wanted their apartments, their furniture, their jewelry. Greed was rebranded as patriotism. In Poland, after liberation, Jewish survivors returned home only to be murdered by locals who had taken their property. They weren't killed by Nazis. They were killed by neighbors. So where is your dividing line? Who do you call good? Who do you call evil? If a man rescues a camp survivor and rapes a local girl the same day, is he a hero or a monster? If a nation saves the world from fascism while nuking cities, is it righteous or rabid? You want simple answers. You want to believe that World War II was a necessary horror, that it taught us lessons, that the moral arc of history bent, finally, toward justice. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The war didn't make us moral. It made us efficient. We learned how to kill better. We learned how to justify atrocities in cleaner language. We learned to replace confession with commemoration. A monument here, a documentary there. Grief, sanitized. And yet, the same gears are turning. Right now, so before you sleep, turn this over in your mind. If everyone believes they're fighting for good, how do you know you're not just another monster in the making? Time doesn't heal, it distorts you. You've been told that time heals all wounds, that the horrors of war fade, that the world moves forward, that distance brings understanding. But time doesn't heal, it distorts. It softens edges that should remain sharp. It sanitizes pain that should still scream. You think World War II is history. You treat it like a completed novel. But time has not closed its pages. It has rewritten them. The Nazi Party wasn't just defeated. It was repackaged. Its architects, those who weren't hanged, were absorbed into post-war governments, universities, industries. Their ideologies didn't vanish. They went underground, then online. In 2020, more than 10,000 neo-Nazi groups operated in over 50 countries. Swastikas are etched on walls in Europe. Hate forums multiply in the shadowed corners of your internet. Teenagers repost memes that reduce genocide to irony. The war is no longer a warning. It's an aesthetic. A generation removed from the gas chambers now wears symbols once bathed in blood because they don't feel what it meant. The distance has diluted the truth. And worse, time has made the perpetrator seem interesting. Hitler. Documentaries flood your streaming platforms. Endless footage. Black and white montages. Ominous music. But what are they doing, really? They're not educating. They're aestheticizing evil. He becomes a character. A tragic villain. A damaged man with a dog. A bunker. A mistress. We humanize him not to understand him, but to consume him. And when evil becomes content, it becomes comfortable. You scroll past photos of Hiroshima's victims' flesh burned, into shadows on stone between cat videos and food ads. That's what time does. It layers atrocity with trivia until the line dissolves. Now imagine this. You are reading Anne Frank's diary in school. You're 14. You know she died. You know she was betrayed. But you also know her story has been made safe. You read her thoughts like literature. You memorize the date of her arrest. You answer a test question. Then you forget. Anne becomes a lesson, not a person. But her story never ended. She died in Bergen-Belsen, shaved bald, bones protruding, infected with lice, vomiting blood. She starved to death. Her sister died beside her. Their bodies were tossed into a pit. Time didn't heal that. Time disguised it. You now visit Holocaust museums, taking selfies next to shoes. You hear recordings of survivors. You listen. You nod. You move on. But here's what they don't tell you. Most survivors say the worst pain came after liberation. After the camps, they returned to countries that didn't want them. Their homes were stolen. Their families were gone. They were told to be grateful, to move on. But you don't move on from waking up next to corpses, from wondering if the rats chewing your feet are real. Some stayed silent for decades, not out of shame, but because no one wanted to listen. And when they finally spoke, the world turned their agony into slogans. Never again. But genocide happened again. In Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar. Time didn't teach. It blurred. In the end, you don't remember the war itself. You remember its retelling. Hollywood gave you heroes, clean endings, triumphant music. You remember Tom Hanks storming Normandy. You remember a soldier crying over his fallen brother. But do you remember the real men? Do you remember the soldier who shot a French girl in the head because he thought she was German? Do you remember the pilot who firebombed an orphanage by accident, then spent the next 60 years trying to forget? Do you even know their names? You are told time makes history clearer, but clarity is an illusion. Time fogs the lens. It gives you simplified villains, curated victims, and digestible trauma. It gives you distance. And distance is the most dangerous drug of all, because it lets you believe that the horror was long ago, far away, and nothing like you. But the mechanics are still here. The language of dehumanization, the machinery of bureaucracy, the algorithms of obedience, the silence of neighbors. Nothing has changed. Only the color of the uniforms. So before you drift off, repeat this quietly. If time distorts the truth to make it bearable, then what else have you misremembered into comfort? The economics of death. You were taught that World War II was fought for freedom, for peace, for the soul of humanity. But beneath every battlefield, behind every banner, in the quiet backrooms of every government, there was another war entirely. The war for profit. War is not chaos. It is commerce. You don't like to think of death in financial terms. You prefer memorials to spreadsheets. But follow the money, and the illusion of righteousness begins to dissolve. Start with IBM. In the 1930s and 40s, IBM leased punch card machines to the Nazis. Machines used to catalog, organize, and efficiently deport Jews. Each camp had its own code. Each prisoner had a number. The system worked with industrial precision. These machines didn't just manage death. They optimized it. When the camps requested more efficient ways to log labor, IBM didn't hesitate. They sent engineers, not out of ideology, not out of malice, but because it was good business. And after the war, they never apologized. They denied responsibility. Because they didn't kill anyone. They just provided the tools. Now ask yourself, How many companies in your life profit from suffering? Next, look at Ford and General Motors. Both companies built vehicles for the Nazis, armored trucks, engines for Luftwaffe aircraft, bombers that attacked Allied cities. And during the war, these same companies collected profits from both sides. Ford sued the US government after the war for bombing its Nazi-owned plants in Germany. And it won. Let that sink in. A corporation built weapons for fascists, got paid, lost its factory, and then got compensated by the country it had betrayed. Profit has no allegiance. The same pattern, repeated across industries. Standard Oil supplied synthetic rubber and fuel additives to the German war machine. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that developed Zyklon B, the gas used in death chambers, had subsidiaries all over the world. After the war, its executives were tried. But soon after, they rejoined society. Some went on to head new pharmaceutical giants. IG Farben's post-war fragments include Bayer. You might have taken their aspirin this week. Do you feel sick yet? You want to believe that these were isolated atrocities, that capitalism and genocide were separate paths. But in truth, they are intertwined. The war economy was not a glitch. It was a model. In the United States, military contracts tripled overnight. Factories converted to build tanks, bombs, rifles. Entire towns sprang up around defense plants. Women entered the workforce not for liberation, but because the gears of war required more hands. And when the war ended, no one wanted to stop. This is where the concept of the military-industrial complex was born. A self-perpetuating engine that requires conflict to justify production. Weapons must be tested. Armies must be funded. Enemies must be found, not for defense, but for demand. World War II created more wealth than any event in modern history. The U.S. economy boomed, corporations grew, banks swelled, and the ashes of Europe were just another market to rebuild. It wasn't just a war for survival. It was a war for repositioning. And the victims? They were fueled. Think about this. The gold teeth of murdered Jews were melted down to fund the Reich. Their hair was used to stuff mattresses. Their bones ground into fertilizer. Their suitcases resoled. Their lives recycled. What is that, if not industry? Even the Allies participated in commodifying death. War bonds, victory gardens, Hollywood, films, slogans and symbols printed on cereal boxes. Your grandfather's war was also a brand. So the question isn't whether World War II was moral. The question is whether morality ever mattered at all. Because as long as death could be monetized, it was. And it still is. Private military contractors profit from global instability. Arms dealers feed both sides of modern conflicts. Nations fund proxy wars not to protect lives, but to protect investments. And all of it is reported in quarterly earnings. So before you sleep, let this settle into the softest part of your brain. If killing becomes profitable, how long before you are simply someone else's margin of gain? Bureaucracy is a weapon. You imagine war as guns and bombs, tanks and trenches. But the most devastating tool of World War II wasn't a weapon. It was paperwork, a form, a stamp, a ledger, a signature. These were the instruments of annihilation. The Nazis didn't begin their genocide with bullets. They began with files, identification cards, racial classifications, residency forms, census data. They turned entire populations into categories. And categories can be deleted. The Nuremberg laws didn't need violence. They needed compliance. Jews were defined not by their beliefs, but by their bloodline. Grandparents were charted. Marriages outlawed. Names indexed. This was genocide by bureaucracy. In the ghettos, food rations were assigned through ledgers. An able-bodied Jew might receive 300 calories a day. A child, 180, less than a glass of milk. Not because of supply, because of policy. Holocaust survivors often say the horror wasn't the violence. It was the paperwork that made it feel legal. When a deportation train left the station, every part of the process was documented. Number of people, time of departure, fuel usage, number of cattle cars. The destination Auschwitz was listed like any other. Shipment point, that's how it worked. Efficient, orderly, death as logistics. And the men who designed these systems, they never pulled a trigger. They filled in columns. Do you know how many people had to say yes for one child to be gassed? A clerk to sign the deportation order, a station master to schedule the train, a conductor to drive it, a guard to open the doors, a camp commandant to wave him in, a chemist to measure the gas, a doctor to pronounce death. Every atrocity was an assembly line, not of monsters, of administrators. And this is the point that should terrify you. Not one step required cruelty. It only required compliance. Think about the banality of evil, a term coined by political theorist Hannah Arendt during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. He was not a bloodthirsty sadist. He was an efficient bureaucrat. He claimed he never killed anyone. And he was right. He just organized the trains. He wasn't punished for being evil. He was punished for being normal in a system where normal meant annihilation. This is why you should never trust just doing my job. Because bureaucracy is not neutral. It is a weapon that hides its blade in policy. Now look at your own world. How much suffering is created, not by villains, but by systems? Immigrants detained indefinitely because of paperwork. Aid denied due to missing documentation. Children separated from families because forms were mislabeled. Lives paused, broken, lost by administrative error. You want to believe we've learned. But in 2021, the U.S. military mistakenly drone-striked an aid worker and his family in Kabul. A clerical misread, a misinterpreted signal. 7 children vaporized. No one was punished. The paperwork was in order. Bureaucracy doesn't need hate. It only needs indifference. You want to believe you are different. But how many emails have you ignored? How many reports have you processed without asking who they harm? How many times have you said, "That's not my department"? That's how it starts. Death doesn't always arrive with a gun. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard. So before you fade into sleep, replay this question. If every atrocity requires 100 tiny permissions, how many of them are you already giving? Language is the first casualty. You think war begins with bombs, but it doesn't. It begins with words. Before a single bullet is fired, the battlefield is linguistically prepared. Definitions shift, meanings rot, and people begin to say things they don't understand until they believe them. In World War II, the Nazis didn't say they were murdering Jews. They said they were conducting the final solution to the Jewish question. They didn't say murder. They said special treatment. They didn't say starvation. They said ration adjustments. They didn't say execution site. They said labor camp. This is euphemism as anesthesia language designed to numb the conscience. When Adolf Eichmann organized mass deportations, he never wrote, "Send 10,000 to die." He said, "Transport 10,000 units." He used freight language, cargo terms. People became objects. Objects became numbers. Numbers became targets, and you can't grieve a number. This is the true danger. Once language collapses, so does morality. Because if you can name horror something else, you never have to confront it. But the Nazis didn't invent this. Every empire has its own euphemistic dialect. The British didn't invade India. They civilized it. The Americans didn't bomb civilians in Vietnam. They executed surgical strikes. Civilians weren't killed. They were collateral damage. Language is a virus that infects ethics. In Japan, during the rape of Nanking, soldiers referred to the mass rape of Chinese women as comforting the troops. Entire regiments were told it was their right, their reward. And the term stuck: comfort. Women. You still use it. What does that say about you? The use interned 120,000 Japanese Americans. But it wasn't called a prison. It was a relocation center. Barbed wire, guard towers, curfews wrapped in a phrase that sounds like urban development. Words reshape reality. Now go deeper. Language doesn't just sanitize horror. It programs it. When children in Nazi Germany learned vocabulary, their textbooks taught them that Jew was a noun, synonymous with disease. They memorized the term subhuman. They spelled it out. They drew it. Before a child learns to pull a trigger, they must learn to name their target. Language becomes destiny. Even after the war, words failed. When survivors spoke, they struggled. How do you describe watching your family turn to ash? There is no grammar for that. No syntax for smoke and screaming. Most survivors fell silent for years. And when they did speak, they were often told, "You should be grateful you lived. At least it's over. It's too horrible to be true." Language failed them twice, first in erasure, then in dismissal. Now, turn to your own tone. How many horrors have you renamed into something bearable? You don't say child starvation. You say food insecurity. You don't say civilian massacre. You say conflict zone. You don't say mass surveillance. You say data collection. Every word you choose either reveals or hides reality. And hiding is easier to say unrest than genocide. Easier to say correctional facility than state-sanctioned. Cage. Easier to say mental health crisis than a system that breaks people and forgets them. So now we arrive at the uncomfortable edge. If words can change the shape of truth, and if truth governs conscience, then what happens when the only language you speak was born in lies? The inheritance of obedience. You believe you are free. You tell yourself that if you were alive during the atrocities of World War II, you would have spoken out, refused to obey, resisted. But history and psychology say otherwise. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a now famous experiment at Yale University. Participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person for incorrect answers on a test. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. They were told the shocks increased in voltage, that the recipient was in pain. They heard screams. They heard banging, pleading. And still over 65% of participants continued to the maximum voltage because the man in the lab coat told them to. This wasn't Nazi Germany. This was America. Ivy League, polite, educated. Milgram single quotes as conclusion: people will obey authority even when it violates their conscience, if they believe it's legitimate. Now go back to 1942. A German train. Conductor is told to deliver a transport of Jews to a camp. He doesn't shoot. He doesn't scream. He simply drives the train because that is his job. Milgram's volunteers weren't monsters. Neither was the conductor. They were you. In 1971. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment took this further. College students were assigned roles, guards, and prisoners in a simulated prison. Within 36 hours, the guards began humiliating, depriving, and abusing the prisoners. Not because they were told to, but because they could. Power didn't corrupt them. It revealed them. And when Zimbardo tried to stop it, he found himself absorbed in the same authoritarian logic. He had become warden. The mask had fused with the face. Now ask yourself, how many roles have you played in your life They changed the way you treated people. When you became a manager, did your empathy shrink? When you became a student, did you defer without question? When you became a citizen, did you inherit obedience? You are not a blank slate. You are the product of generations trained to obey. Think of the education system. Rows, bells, uniforms, punishment for deviation, rewards for silence. It is not a place to learn it. It is a place to conform. You don't learn how to think. You learn how to respond. Raise your hand. Wait your turn. Repeat the right answer. The war didn't create this. It exposed it. In the Nuremberg trials, countless Nazis defended themselves by saying, "I was just following orders." The world recoiled, but it failed to see the deeper truth. Obedience is default. Resistance is the anomaly. And when resistance does happen, when someone refuses, it's rarely glorified in the moment. It is punished, erased, buried. Ask yourself, do you really think you'd hide a Jew in your attic, knowing it meant death for your entire family? Or would you glance away, stay quiet, tell yourself, it's not my responsibility? Because that's what most people did. They weren't evil. They were ordinary. And ordinary is lethal when obedience is law. In 1999, psychologist Thomas Bloss reviewed over 100 obedience studies from around the world. His conclusion was haunting. Milgram's findings replicate across cultures, decades, and contexts. The results don't change. People obey not because they're weak, but because the system makes disobedience feel impossible. And in today's world, obedience is no longer forced, it is gamified. You follow terms of service. You scroll terms of consent. You accept surveillance in exchange for convenience. Your algorithm watches you not with boots, but with offers. You obey passively. And you think that means freedom. But here's the truth. You do not need to be chained to be controlled. So now listen carefully. As the silence deepens around you, if obedience feels normal and resistance feels dangerous, how would you ever recognize the moment when you've become the villain? Childhood was never innocent. You believe that childhood is a protected space, pure, unformed, untouched by darkness. You see war as a thing that happens to adults, soldiers, leaders, nations. But war doesn't spare the young. It sculpts them. In World War II, children weren't bystanders. They were participants, victims, weapons. Start with Hitler Youth, a system designed not to educate, but to indoctrinate. Boys as young as 10 were trained to handle rifles, recite propaganda, memorize bloodlines. They were taught to obey, to inform, to fight. By 1945, these children were conscripted to hold the front lines against Allied tanks. Children not even old enough to shave sent to die for a collapsing ideology. Some cried, some fled, but many stayed. Many fought because they believed. Belief, when implanted early, doesn't require reason. It only requires ritual. Now consider the T4 euthanasia program, the Nazi campaign to eliminate the unfit. Thousands of children with disabilities were taken from homes and hospitals, told they were being relocated for better care. They were injected, gassed, starved. This wasn't done in secret. It was done with documentation, with language of kindness. Medical personnel called it mercy killing. Parents were often told their child had died peacefully in their sleep, but some were told the truth, and still they didn't fight. Because the state had more power than the womb. In Japanese-occupied Nanking, children were mutilated in front of their parents. Infants tossed in the air, bayoneted mid-fall. This is not hyperbole. It is documented, described, eyewitness. The perpetrators laughed. In Soviet Russia, children were used to inform on their parents. A child who reported his father for anti-party speech was praised as a national hero. The father was executed. The boy was celebrated. State over blood. Obedience over love. What does a child become when they are taught to betray their own family? And what does that child teach their child? The war didn't end when the bombs stopped. It continued in homes, in orphanages, in mines, children raised. In the camps, some barely old enough to speak were never the same. They forgot how to play, how to cry. Some developed selective mutism, choosing silence for years. Not because they couldn't speak, but because nothing was safe to say. In London, children were evacuated during the Blitz, sent to the countryside, away from their parents, told it was for their protection. Many were never reunited. Some were abused by their host families, forgotten, misplaced. Every country has its myth of protection. But war never spares the smallest ones. It just uses them more quietly. Even in America, where the mainland was untouched, children played with toy soldiers, watched newsreels of carnage, drew Hitler with devil horns, collected scrap metal for the war effort. Innocence was mobilized, turned into a performance, and when soldiers came home, often broken, they brought silence with them. They didn't speak of what they'd seen, so their children learned not truth, but shadows. The war lived on in the gaps, in the sudden rages, in the drinking, in the absences. The cycle begins early. Today, children still march in militias, still dig graves, still carry rifles taller than themselves. But you call that a developing world problem. You don't see the psychological trenches in your own suburbs, where screens show shootings, and headlines scream horror, and trauma becomes background noise. And what are your children learning? That evil is far away, that war is history? Or are they learning to dissociate, to scroll past suffering, to laugh at violence, to mimic ideologies they don't yet understand? The world is still teaching, every minute, and war is still the lesson. So before you drift into the numbness of sleep, answer this. If a child can be taught to kill, who taught you to forget? The architecture of forgetting. You assume forgetting is passive, that it happens quietly, that memories fade like fog, unintended, natural, benign. But forgetting is not decay. It is designed. Governments build it. Institutions reinforce it, and you comply with it. Every time you choose comfort over confrontation, every time you say, "That was a long time ago," every time you look away. After World War II, there were trials. The Nuremberg trials, yes. A few were hanged. A few were jailed. But what you don't realize is that over 90% of Nazi perpetrators were never punished. They returned to their lives. They became doctors, professors, police chiefs, politicians. The German judiciary, after the war, was staffed with former Nazis. They prosecuted no one, investigated nothing. And so the machine stayed intact, just with new labels. In Austria, entire swaths of the population claimed to have been victims of Nazism, despite the fact that thousands enthusiastically participated. It became national policy. We were occupied. Not, we collaborated. Forgetfulness was political. In Japan, history textbooks omit or downplay war crimes, calling the rape of Nanking a conflict or incident. Comfort women are described as voluntary. Children grow up believing their country's past was unfortunate, not monstrous. Even in America, textbooks gloss over the firebombing of Tokyo, the internment of Japanese Americans, the refusal to accept Jewish refugees. Instead, students are taught about D-Day and victory and heroism. What is left out becomes invisible. This is curated amnesia, and it is not accidental. In 1948, West Germany passed the 131 Law, reinstating Nazi-era officials into civil service, giving them pensions and privileges. Over 77% of West Germany's justice ministry by 1957 had Nazi affiliations. That wasn't forgetfulness. That was forgiveness without atonement. But the world didn't mind, because forgetting is contagious. Hollywood helped, with films that focused on noble soldiers, tragic losses, clean distinctions between good and evil. The Holocaust became the focal point because it was clearly monstrous. But the thousands of less photogenic atrocities, they were shelled. Villages razed, families disappeared, experiments conducted in secret, all buried under the label of post-war recovery. The silence wasn't just loud, it was systemic. Now look around you. How many genocides have you not heard about? How many massacres never made the news cycle? How many governments have rewritten history in their favor? You think memory is a mirror, but it's a map drawn by the victors. And when victims try to speak, they're often disbelieved, dismissed, told, why bring that up again? Because forgetting protects the powerful. And the cycle repeats. There are still families searching for bones in Eastern Europe. There are still survivors of Unit 731 in Japan, where human beings were dissected alive waiting for acknowledgement. Still mothers in the Balkans, digging in shallow graves for sons executed in cold blood. But the world moves on. Because time, as we've already said, does not heal. It distorts. And distortion is maintained through omission. It's easy. You change a few words in a textbook. You replace one photo. You delay a museum's funding. You say, there are two sides to every story, until eventually, there's no story left to tell. And the worst part? You don't notice, because forgetting doesn't feel like deletion. It feels like normalcy. So before you surrender to sleep, stare into the blank spaces between what you know and what you've chosen not to learn. And ask yourself, if forgetting is easier than remembering, how much of what you think is truth is actually just a silence you never questioned? Truth has no witnessy. I've been told that the truth always comes out. That reality, no matter how hidden, will eventually surface. But that's a myth, because truth doesn't emerge by itself. It requires witnesses. And witnesses are fragile. They die, they forget, they stay silent. Or they are silenced. During World War II, millions were killed without records, villages erased without names, families gassed before a single document could list them. Entire populations vanished so efficiently, so brutally, that even historians now call them the missing facts. In the Soviet Gulag system, tens of millions passed through forced labor camps. How many died? No one knows. Archives were altered, files burned, testimonies lost. Stalin's bureaucrats made sure truth wasn't just buried, it was incinerated. What does it mean when an atrocity leaves no trace? Does it become less real? Or does it become even more dangerous? In Unit 731, a covert Japanese biological warfare program, prisoners were subjected to unspeakable tortures, vivisections without anesthesia, frostbite experiments, plague infections. These weren't war criminals. They were scientists, doctors, surgeons. And after the war, they weren't punished. The U.S. granted them immunity in exchange for their research. They dissected humans alive and were rewarded with jobs and freedom. That truth was classified, hidden, forgotten. For decades, no one believed the survivors. No documents, no film, no confession, until a few brave whistleblowers began to talk, quietly, risking their lives. And even then, most people didn't care, because truth without a witness is just noise, easily dismissed, easily denied. In Poland, after the Holocaust, Jewish survivors returned home to find strangers living in their houses. When they asked for their properties back, they were murdered. No papers, no trials, just elimination. If no one saw it, did it happen? If it wasn't photographed, does it matter? Now think of all the events in your own life that no one else remembers, the injustices you never reported, the moments you swallowed, the abuse that left no mark. Did those events cease to be real, or did you cease to exist in that moment as someone whose experience could be validated? That's what totalitarianism understands perfectly. If you erase the witness, you erase the truth, and once that's done, reality becomes malleable, rewritten, controlled, reissued with edits. This isn't historical theory. This is now. Governments still classify mass killings. Corporations still bury toxic secrets. Journalists are silenced. Whistleblowers imprisoned. Survivors DISB, ELIEVED. And the world keeps spinning because no one saw. You live in a world of filters, news curated by clicks, visibility dictated by algorithms. The truth is there, somewhere, but it's been buried under convenience. And so you scroll past horror without context. Footage of war, photos of carnage, bodies blurred, blood pixelated. A warning, sensitive content. Click to see, or don't. That's not awareness. That's optional reality. So the next time you say, I didn't know, remember this? You didn't witness it because you chose not to look. Now rest your head in the quiet and let this thought echo into the back of your mind. If truth needs a witness, and no one is watching anymore, has reality already been replaced? Numbers cannot mourn. You've been taught to measure tragedy in numbers. 6 million Jews, 27 million Soviets, 60 million dead in total. Each digit a monument. But numbers are cold, precise, dead. You believe that quantifying pain helps us understand it, that it gives weight to history, that statistics make things real. But here is the deception. Numbers numb. You do not feel 6 million. You cannot imagine 60 million. The mind blanks. The heart closes. You say the number, but your pulse does not. Rise. This is not your fault. It is your design. Psychologists call it psychic numbing, a cognitive phenomenon where empathy declines as the number of victims increases. One person suffering, you care. 10, you worry. 1,000, you change the channel. A million, you feel nothing. During the Holocaust, Nazis used numbers to erase identity. Prisoners were tattooed with digits. Names were removed. Language vanished. Families were split by classification. A child might become B3075. A mother, C4112. No longer people. Just data points. They didn't bury people. They burned units. And after the war, the world inherited this language. We say casualties. We say losses. We say figures. We build museums where numbers are engraved in stone, but faces are missing. Even in your own media, death is delivered numerically. A drone strike kills 32. A flood displaces 1,400. A virus infects 2.8 million. What does that even mean to you? Nothing unless you knew one of them. But the people who died weren't numbers. They were voices, bodies, small habits, secret fears, favorite songs, quiet jokes, regrets, scars, loved ones. You don't remember them because you never met them. But the loss is still there. A Polish girl named Bluma used to draw stars in her notebook. She was shot in a forest outside Lublin. A French boy named David collected postcards of steam trains. He died in a cattle car. A Soviet mother named Anya used to sing lullabies about rivers. Her body was never found. These are the ghosts buried inside every statistic. And you are trained not to see them. In modern warfare, soldiers no longer count enemy dead. They estimate. They use drones, heat signatures, analytics. Even grief is outsourced. And when civilians die, They are labeled collateral, their existence reduced to legal ambiguity. You inherit this blindness. You talk about tragedy like inventory. You tally the damage. You move on. Because the scale is too large. Because you must. Otherwise, your mind would fracture. But this is the wound that never heals. When grief is denied its depth, when mourning is replaced by math dot, there is no equation. That can contain genocide, dot, no chart that can weep dot, and in trying to quantify death, you lose its meaning. You abstract it. You make it manageable. But death was never meant to be managed dot. So as the night closes around you, and the numbers continue to flash on your screen, stop pretending they tell you anything. Instead, ask yourself, if numbers can't mourn, and names have been erased, who is left to carry the weight of remembering? The myth of the clean war you've been taught, there's a difference between good war and bad war. That World War II was the just war. That there were heroes and villains, and the line between them was clear. But war has no clean edges. You've been given stories of valor of paratroopers and liberators, resistance fighters and codebreakers. You imagine tidy uniforms, strategic victories, noble sacrifice. What you weren't told is this: the Allies committed atrocities too. During the bombing of Dresden, over 25,000 civilians, most of them women, children, and refugees, were incinerated. By Allied firestorms, the city wasn't a military target. It was a cultural center. The air burned at over 1,500 degrees. People's skin melted as they ran. This wasn't an accident. It was strategy. The firebombing of Tokyo killed over 100,000 civilians in one night. More than Hiroshima. More than Nagasaki. Women clutching children drowned in boiling canals as they tried to escape. Entire neighborhoods burned so hot that the asphalt liquefied and the bombs kept falling, because this was total war. And in total war, everyone is guilty. The myth of the clean war insists that the Axis committed the crimes, and the Allies cleaned them up. But there are mass graves across Europe and Asia that don't fit that narrative. Vietnamese who still suffer birth defects from Agent Orange. Ask the Koreans used as slave labor by American-backed regimes after Japan fell. Ask the German civilians, widows, orphans who were starved by Allied blockades even after the surrender. There were no victors. Just survivors dot, and beneath every victory march, there were piles of bones dot, you see. Justice in war is not measured by the moral clarity of your cause, but by the amount of blood you're willing to ignore. Dot. The Nazis built the camps, but British. Colonial forces ran concentration camps in Kenya and South Africa, long before Hitler came to power. Yes, the Germans experimented on prisoners, but American scientists injected black men with syphilis in the Tuskegee experiment for 40 years withholding treatment just to observe the effects. You think of war crimes as an exception, but they are the method, and the label war crime is only applied when you lose. What happens to the Allied officers who raped women in liberated France and Italy? Forgotten. Denied. What happens to the civilians caught between tanks and airstrikes? Forgotten. Denied. Because morality in war is not symmetrical. It's weaponized, and when the war ends, the myths begin. Hollywood films erase the screams. Memorials focus on triumph. Museums divide the world into black and white. You aren't taught how to think about war. You're taught how to remember it the way someone else wants you to. You're given the comfort of good guys, the satisfaction of justice served, the illusion that it all made sense. But war never makes sense. It simply continues, beneath new names, behind new flags, with newer, cleaner language. And now, as you lie in bed, far from the firestorms, far from the mass graves, ask yourself this: if every side in war stains its hands in blood, then what, exactly, are you celebrating when you call it victory? The silence between generations. You grow up thinking your family history is complete. That your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, all of them lived lives filled with routine and love and struggle and survival. In families shaped by war, there are always missing chapters. World War II didn't just kill bodies. It shattered lineages. And in the decades that followed, it wrapped millions of people in silence. Silence is inherited. It seeps into bedrooms. It lingers at the dinner table. It infects the air between questions never asked and answers never offered. You've heard the stories, haven't you? A grandfather who doesn't talk about the war. A great-aunt who lost siblings but won't say how. A family photo album with missing faces, cut out with scissors. Every silence has a shape. Survivors, veterans, displaced people, they often didn't speak of what they endured, not because they forgot, but because the truth is corrosive, and they feared it would destroy those who came after. So they buried it. But the burial didn't erase the damage. It passed it on. Children of Holocaust survivors often report symptoms of PTSD, despite never having lived in a camp. Nightmares, hypervigilance, deep-seated dread. This is called transgenerational trauma. It's real. It's measurable. Cortisol levels, brain chemistry, memory encoding. You can inherit fear you don't understand. In Eastern Europe, children raised by parents who survived Stalin's purges often describe feeling watched even decades after. The surveillance state collapsed. Why? Because paranoia doesn't need cameras to survive. It needs only memory. Even in your own family, there are probably shadows. A grandfather who drank too much. A grandmother who cried in her sleep. A parent who couldn't show love, but never explained why. These are echoes of violence they could never name. And here's the bleak truth. Sometimes, survival makes people cruel. Many of those who lived through the war became hard, distant, abusive. Because survival requires compartmentalization. And once you build those compartments, they don't come down easily. They become architecture, the structure of your home. You may not know the names of the battles they fought, but you live inside their aftermath. And what about the perpetrators? What about the German soldier who came home and never spoke of the camp he guarded? What about the Japanese officer who returned to his family and lived a quiet life, never revealing what he'd done in Nanking? Their children grew up too, with fathers who were silent, or angry, or unreachable. Some of them found out decades later through old letters, through declassified documents, through survivors who recognized faces in photographs. Imagine finding out at age 40 that your father was a war criminal. What does that do to your identity? You think the war ended in 1945, but a DIDN single quotes T. It continues in the minds of the people who inherited it. It continues in the way some cultures refuse to teach history, while others are consumed by it. It continues in trauma passed down genetically, behaviorally, emotionally. And it continues in you, because silence doesn't fade. It ferments. So here's the question you must ask yourself before sleep takes you. If every generation inherits its silence, what horrors have you been trained never to notice? The body remembers what the mind denies. You believe forgetting is mental. That trauma lives in thoughts, and that healing is about ideas, words, understanding. But trauma is not intellectual. It is cellular. The body stores what the mind cannot process. This is not poetry. This is neuroscience. During extreme trauma, the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, goes into overdrive. The hippocampus, responsible for encoding memories in time and language, begins to shut down. This is why trauma often isn't recalled as a narrative. It's recalled as a sensation. Not "I was there," but a sound, a smell, a sudden jolt in the chest, the scream of an air raid, The scent of burned hair, the way your hands wouldn't stop shaking. For Holocaust survivors. 4. Bombing victims, for soldiers, refugees, and prisoners. The trauma doesn't live in the mind. It lives in the nervous system, and it passes down. Epigenetics is the study of how trauma alters gene expression. In 2016, researchers at Mount Sinai Hospital found that the children of Holocaust survivors had biological markers of trauma despite never experiencing the events themselves. Their stress responses were mutated. You can inherit a tremor, a shadow, an unnamed anxiety that was never yours to begin with. Your body becomes an archive, and it is constantly triggered. Loud noises, sudden changes, isolation, hunger, all of them are reminders, not to your conscious mind, but to the part of your brain that doesn't use words. The part that reacts. In war, your body is reprogrammed to survive, not to live. A child who watched their mother die learns that safety is impossible. A soldier who crawled through corpses learns that stillness is dangerous. A refugee who crossed deserts on foot learns that rest is betrayal. These lessons get written into flesh. And after the war ends, the habits stay: overeating, undersleeping, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, rage that arrives without warning, shame with no origin. These are the scars of a body trained to expect death at any moment. Now look at your own behaviors. Why do you panic at certain sounds? Why does your chest tighten in crowds? Why do you cry during thunderstorms? Is it yours? Or was it given to you? We treat trauma like an illness of the weak, something to be overcome. But the reality is crueler. Trauma is a sign of survival. The people who don't feel it often didn't live to. Great-grandfather may never have spoken about the war, but his shaking hands, his silence, his distance, that was the trauma speaking. And you may never have gone hungry. But if you hoard food, flinch at sirens, sleep lightly, your body may still think it's 1942. You are haunted by memories that were never yours. And this haunts you even more. Trauma is often invisible, not because it isn't real, but because you've been trained not to believe it. You say, that was long ago. You say, I'm just sensitive. You say, it's nothing. But your blood knows otherwise. So now, as your body prepares for sleep and your heartbeat slows, listen to what remains beneath the silence. If the body remembers what history denies, then how much of you is built from pain you've never even named? The border between civilization and collapse. You've been taught that civilization is solid, that the world you live in, streets, laws, electricity, order is the default. That collapse is something rare, distant, unimaginable. Collapse is always closer than you think. In 1941, Kiev was a city of culture, universities, cafes, literature, music. Within months, it became a slaughterhouse. In the ravine of Babi Yar, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. Shot, layered, buried. No earthquake, no pandemic, just ideology, uniforms, and permission. The border between civilization and atrocity is paper thin. Your comfort exists only because systems are currently working. Remove electricity for a week. Stop fuel deliveries. Shut down the internet. Break the food chain. Undermine the rule of law. Happens. Would your neighbors stay civil? Would the strangers you pass on the street remain polite? Or would they revert quickly to something you don't recognize? During World War II, Paris fell in 6 weeks. Greece starved under occupation. Poland disappeared from maps. One moment, families at dinner. The next, boots at the door. Collapse isn't loud. It's sudden, and the people who survive it aren't the strongest. They're the most adaptable and often the most ruthless. history doesn't move in straight lines. It's convolutes dot, and every society imagines it's the exception, that its institutions are unbreakable, that its people are too moral to turn. But Germany in the 1920s was a democracy, with art, science, liberalism. Jews served in parliament. Berlin was the heart of European modernism. By 1933, it was ruled by a man who believed in racial purity. And by 1939, its doctors were murdering disabled children for the good of the state. How long do you think that descent took? Not long, because the structures were there. The resentment was there. All it needed was a trigger, a story, a scapegoat. You already see the same signs around you. Conspiracy as entertainment. Hatred rebranded as freedom. Law enforcement turned into ideology. Truth reduced to opinion. Media addicted to fear. Systems creaking under weight they can't bear. And most terrifyingly, a population that thinks collapse won't happen because it hasn't happened yet. But that's exactly how it happens. In 1945, the streets of Berlin were full of corpses. Civilians eating wallpaper paste to survive. People living in basements beneath rubble. Every single one of them had believed 10 years earlier that their world was untouchable. You may think your reality is permanent, but it isn't. Civilization is a story we tell ourselves every morning. And all it takes is a failed delivery, a corrupt official, a lie told at the wrong moment to tear it open. You think you'll recognize the moment it starts, but no one ever does. Collapse doesn't look like fire. It looks like routine until the routine doesn't return. So as you lie in your bed, surrounded by walls and light and quiet comfort, ask yourself this. If civilization is just a pause in the chaos of history, how will you know when the pause has ended? Memory is a battlefield. You think memory is personal, that it belongs to you, that your mind is a vault, a private record of what happened. But memory is not yours. It is shaped, rewritten, edited-weaponized. In war, the first casualty is truth, but the second, often more enduring, is memory. After World War II, there was a global race to define the narrative. Who won? Who suffered? Who resisted? Who complied? Each country rewrote itself. In France, the myth of the resistance bloomed. The idea that nearly everyone had opposed the Nazis, that collaboration was rare. But this was a lie. Over 70,000 French citizens were executed or imprisoned after the war for helping the occupiers. Many weren't punished for resistance. They were punished because they revealed the truth of how common compliance had been. In Japan, war crimes were erased through curriculum. Children grew up unaware of the atrocities committed in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Comfort women? Bioweapons? Nanking? Absent. Whitewashed? Muted. The result? Generations who genuinely believed their country was only a victim. In the Soviet Union, memory was controlled like currency. Names were removed from photographs. Histories rewritten annually. Even mentioning a banned fact could result in prison or execution. Entire families vanished from the record. This isn't unique to history. It is happening now. Memory is curated by power. Look at the monuments around you. Who is on the pedestal? What year is chiseled in stone? What names are missing? You are being told who to remember and how. When Americans remember World War II, they remember Normandy, Pearl Harbor, the Holocaust. But not the ships full of Jewish refugees turned away from U.S. shores, not the lynchings of black soldiers in uniform after they returned home. Not the nuclear experiments conducted on American citizens without consent. Memory is a design. And if you don't control the narrative, someone else will build it around you. Museums, textbooks, holidays, statues, films. These are not just cultural artifacts. They are tools of memory manipulation. A Holocaust museum shows you piles of shoes, but not the American immigration policies that refused entry to the people who once wore them. A war movie shows you the courage of soldiers, but not the rape. Of 2 million German women by Soviet troops during the advance to Berlin, you live among fragments, sculpted illusions, half-remembered stories, and even when survivors speak, they're often D-I-S-B-E-L-I-E-V-E-D. Memory is shaped by repetition, by evidence, by power dot, and most dangerously, by convenience dot. It's easier to remember your country as heroic, your family as innocent, your species as redeemable, but that's not history. That's mythology dot, and when the real memories resurface, when the photos are found, the bodies exhumed, the testimony translated, your instinct is to look away. Because memory, when unfiltered, is unbearable. You don't want to remember the boy shot for stealing bread, the girl forced to clean blood from the floor with her blouse, the grandmother who sewed her valuables into her coat only to be burned with it. These aren't just memories. They're mirrors. They reflect who you are, what you've ignored, what you've allowed dot. So now, ask yourself in the darkness, if memory is a battlefield, who is winning the war inside your mind? Progress is a mirage. I've been told that history moved forward. That progress is inevitable. That every war, every horror, every atrocity brings lessons that shape a better future. But progress is not a line. It is a circle, and you're walking it blindly. Look at the post-World War II world. The war was supposed to end fascism, racism, genocide. It was supposed to teach humanity a final lesson. But what followed? Within 5 years, the Korean War began. Within 10, McCarthyism in America turned patriotism into paranoia. Within 20, the Vietnam War normalized the mass bombing of civilians again. Within 30, Cambodia became a killing field dot in the name of stability. Dictators were propped up across Latin America, Africa, Asia, trained by Western powers, backed by corporations, armed with ideologies rooted in fear. Millions more died, different flags, same outcomes dot, and yet every time you are told, this is for peace, for freedom, for democracy. Even as mass graves grew deeper, you think things get better. But your improvement is statistical, not ethical dot. Yes, fewer people live in poverty. Yes, diseases have vaccines. Yes, technology has advanced dot, but have you evolved? You still glorify war in cinema, still fund militaries more than education, still build walls faster than homes, still cheer for surgical strikes and shock and awe. Progress has become aesthetics. Your buildings are taller, your phones are faster, your bombs are cleaner, but your morality hasn't moved. Even worse, your atrocities have become more efficient. Drones kill silently. Propaganda spreads algorithmically. Disinformation is automated. You don't even need consent anymore, just attention. During World War II, millions had to be trained to kill dot. Now, all it takes is a click. Genocide no longer needs boots on the ground. It only needs dehumanization at scale dot. And that happens every day through jokes, slurs, headlines, laws, screens. Progress? In Rwanda, the genocide lasted 100 days. Over 800,000 people slaughtered, many with machetes. The World Watch did nothing in Myanmar. Rohingya Muslims were driven out, tortured, raped, killed. Still ongoing in China. Uyghurs are detained in re-education camps. The economy moved forward. The world does business. What lesson was learned? Where is the progress? The only thing that's changed is your threshold for horror. You used to be shocked by images of corpses. Now you scroll past them. You used to mourn tragedy. Now you monetize it. You think this is evolution. but it's adaptation to cruelty. You're not building a better world. You're building a better illusion. And that's the most dangerous kind, because a lie wrapped in progress feels like hope. And hope, misused, becomes anesthesia. You stop fighting. You say, at least it's better than before. But is it? Or have you just become better at justifying the same decay? So ask yourself tonight, as you lie in the false comfort of your clean, modern world, if progress was real, why does every new atrocity feel so familiar? Language was the first weapon. You think war begins with bombs, with invasions, with tanks crossing borders. But at DOESN T.war begins with language. Long before the first bullet is fired, someone names an enemy. The words chosen are never neutral. In Nazi Germany, Jews were not called people. They were parasites, vermin, contagion. The Nazis didn't need to convince millions to murder their neighbors. They only needed to convince them that those neighbors weren't human. And it worked, because once language reduces a person to a label, violence becomes logical. The Tutsis in Rwanda were called cockroaches on radio broadcasts every morning. Not for a week. Not for a month. For years. And then came the machetes. In America. Japanese Americans weren't imprisoned during World War II. They were placed in relocation centers. Civilians weren't killed. They were collateral damage. Torture wasn't torture. It was enhanced interrogation. Language doesn't just describe reality. It rebuilds it. Once you reframe murder as necessity, cruelty as justice, hatred as patriotism, then genocide becomes policy. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's great purge wasn't called terror. It was called cleansing. People weren't executed. They were disappeared. Records were adjusted. Families were restructured. When language is contaminated, truth rots. And that rot spreads through generations. You inherit the poison without knowing. Think of the words you use now. How often do you say illegal immigrant instead of refugee? Rioter instead of protester? Threat instead of child? These choices aren't just vocabulary. They're ideological scaffolding. Every headline, every textbook, every press release, it builds your understanding, not of what happened, but how you're supposed to feel about what happened. World War II taught this lesson with brutal clarity. Every genocide begins with a dictionary of denial, and you are surrounded by them. Algorithms feed you language that reinforces what you already believe. News outlets sharpen their phrasing to align with your bias. Political speeches are tested for emotional response, not accuracy. You don't read facts. You read framed narratives. And framing is everything. Say, a young girl was shot. You feel horror. Say, a 16-year-old was neutralized during a police operation. You feel safety. Same event. Different meaning. Language creates morality. That's why it's the first thing totalitarian regimes control. Books are banned. Words outlawed. New terms introduced. In Nazi Germany, even love was legislated. Marriage was renamed racial hygiene. In fascist Italy, dissent became defamation of the fatherland. In Imperial Japan, surrender wasn't strategic. It was shameful, forbidden, silenced. Even silence becomes a kind of language. Under oppression, and you learn to speak with your choices, with your obedience, with your refusal to ask. So now, as you lie in bed, saturated in a lifetime of curated language, ask yourself, if every war begins with words, which ones are already guiding your hand? The invention of the other. You weren't born seeing enemies. You were taught. At first, the world was just faces, smiles, hands, voices, until someone pointed and said, they're not like us. And that is how the other is born. This process, this construction of us versus them, isn't a glitch of history. It is the engine of violence. In Nazi Germany. This othering began long before the camps, before the ghettos. It began with textbooks, with children taught to draw Jews with hooked noses and filthy clothes. It began with law subtle at first. No intermarriage, no certain jobs. Then louder, wear the star, vacate your home, enter the train. Each step made the next one seem reasonable. This isn't unique to Germany. In Imperial Japan, Koreans were not considered human. They were inferior stock, born to serve. Entire towns were forced to adopt Japanese names, language, and culture or die. Korean women were abducted into military, brothels, and renamed. The identity erased. Replaced. This is the power of the other. Once you believe someone is not fully human, anything becomes permissible. And that belief is always crafted. By slogans. By cartoons. By speeches. By silence. The Hutus and Tutsis were not ancient enemies. Their ethnic divisions were invented by Belgian colonizers, who classified them based on nose width, skin tone, cattle ownership. Then they gave power to one group and watched the seeds rot into genocide. The same template, again and again. Invent a difference, name it, amplify it, then blame it. Jews blamed for economic collapse. Armenians blamed for political instability. Muslims blamed for terror. Immigrants blamed for disease. The poor blamed for laziness. The other is not an identity. It's a scapegoat costume, worn by whoever power decides must be sacrificed. And you think you're immune? Look at your own history. Who taught you that your country is better? That your race is more moral? That your God is correct? That your flag means peace? Who did they tell you to distrust? Now look at the words you use when speaking of people who look different. Who love differently. Who believe differently. Who live across invisible borders. Where did you learn that suspicion? Because that suspicion has a function. It protects the machine. Wars require others. Camps require others. Silence requires others. Even now, there are children growing up learning who they're supposed to hate, not because they feel hatred, but because they're taught that belonging requires exclusion. You don't just learn who you are, you learn who you are not. And in that gap, the space between self and other violence waits patiently. So tonight, as your thoughts dim and silence settles, consider this. If the other is always invented, how long before someone decides that you no longer belong? The lie of the last war, you've heard it all your life. Never again. After every genocide, after every mass grave. After every smoking ruin, the same promise. But it's a lie, because history doesn't end. It repeats with different names, sharper tools, quieter justifications. World War II was supposed to be the final lesson, the climax of cruelty, the turning point for humankind. You built the United Nations. You wrote the Geneva Conventions. You said the words, crimes against humanity. But words don't stop blood. Since 1945, there have been over 250 armed conflicts, dozens of genocides, tens of millions more dead. In Cambodia, Pol Pot's regime killed a quarter of the population. In Sudan, Darfur burned as the world debated terminology. In Bosnia, neighbors killed neighbors with farming tools. In Syria, gas turned civilians blue in the streets. Each time, the world said, "We didn't know. We weren't ready. We thought it would stop." But you did know. You had the satellite images. The intelligence, the testimonies. You looked away, not out of ignorance, but exhaustion. Empathy isn't endless. It decays. This is what psychologists call compassion fatigue, the slow erosion of feeling as the numbers rise, the headlines blur, and the horror becomes background noise. You scroll through genocide the same way you scroll through celebrity. Gossip. War crimes become content. And still, leaders repeat the same old phrases. The last war. The final solution. The war to end all wars. But there is no finality. Only momentary pauses, because war is not an anomaly. It's a ritual. Economies require it. Politics fuel it. Media reframes it. And morality? Morality is bent around. It, like steel under heat. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people swore never again. But today, over 13,000 nuclear warheads remain on this planet, most of them far deadlier than the originals. Every major power plans for the next war, while pretending to mourn the last. And you? You post photos of peace. You share quotes from Gandhi. You march once a year. Then you vote for men who build weapons. Because deep down, you no longer believe peace is permanent. You've accepted war like weather, a storm that comes and goes, unavoidable. And yet, you still repeat the phrase, never again, never again, never again. But history laughs every time you say it, because there is no last war. There is only the next one. So ask yourself now, before sleep takes you under, if never again has already happened again and again. What lie will you tell yourself when it happens next? The banality of evil. You expect evil to look monstrous. Sharp teeth, wild eyes, explosive violence. You expect to recognize it when it comes. But most evil wears a suit. It arrives on time. It follows protocol. It smiles at the front desk. In 1961, Adolf Eichmann stood trial for his role in organizing the logistics of the Holocaust trains, deportation schedules, camp management. He was not a sadist, not a general, not a brute. He was a bureaucrat. He never killed with his own hands. He simply processed the papers. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who attended his trial, described what she saw as the banality of evil, the horrifying normalcy of a man who murdered millions with memos. He didn't hate Jews. He didn't love the Führer. He just did his job efficiently. That's the terrifying part. Want evil to be passionate, vengeful, irrational. Because then it's easy to oppose. But what happens when evil is boring? A man approving supply orders for Zyklin B gas. A clerk filing transport documents for children. Factory foremen ignoring screams from the wall. All of them performing routine tasks. This is how evil spreads. Through systems, not through madness, but through compliance. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment proved this. In 1963, participants were told to deliver electric shocks to a stranger when they answered questions incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. Most of them went all the way to the maximum voltage, believing they were inflicting fatal pain. Why? Because an authority figure in a white lab coat said, "Please continue." That's all it took. Not ideology, not cruelty, just instruction. You're not immune to this. You've already obeyed things you don't understand, agreed to terms. You didn't read. Let injustice slide because it wasn't your problem. And every system counts on that. The Nazis didn't need 1,000,000 maniacs. They needed 1,000,000 functionaries. You think you'd be the exception, the resistor, the whistleblower, but would you? When the order comes from someone above you, in calm language, with a stamped seal, would you refuse? Or would you say what they all said? I was just doing my job. Because that phrase has echoed through every trial, every investigation, every atrocity. In Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Cambodia, in Malay, in Abu Ghraib. I didn't mean to. I didn't think I had a choice. I was afraid. I didn't enjoy it. I was told to. You may not be a killer, but systems don't need killers. They need cooperation. So now, before sleep takes you, let this question crawl beneath your skin. If evil no longer needs to look evil, how will you recognize it in yourself? The comfort of distancy, you've watched the footage, the camps, the bombings, the skeletal survivors. You've seen the bodies stacked like timber, the eyes staring back through barbed wire, the cities reduced to ash and bone. But you felt safe because you were watching from a distance. A screen, a page, a classroom dot, and distance, you were told, makes you objective. But what if distance doesn't make you moral? It makes you numb. Think of the Allied soldiers who liberated the concentration camps in 1945. Some wept, some vomited, some took photographs. A few stood still staring into the mass graves, saying nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because the reality shattered comprehension. Now think about yourself. You've seen more images of atrocity than any generation in history. Your phone contains more horror than the war rooms of 1945. You scroll through suffering. You repost it. You share it, and then you forget. Because you can. Because the distance between you and the dying is measured in pixels. A bombing in Gaza. A mass grave in Ukraine. A girl bleeding in Congo. You pause. Feel something. Then you swipe. You don't mean to be cruel. You're just conditioned to endure images without intervention. It's not your fault. You were born into a world where suffering is ambient. Constant with a line between entertainment and emergency is blurred. You watch a genocide followed by a makeup tutorial. War crime followed by a cat video. Child screaming followed by a recipe. Your empathy never has time to settle. It flickers, then vanishes. This is what the psychologists call compartmentalization. It's how you survive the overload. But it's also how you participate in it. Because when horror becomes just another window, it no longer matters whether you agree or oppose. You are passive. And passivity sustains power. The people who designed Auschwitz depended on passivity. The engineers who built the gas chambers never saw the victims. The guards who locked the doors never looked inside. The companies that supplied the chemicals focused on profit margins. Not corpses. Distance was their shield. You inherit that shield every time. You consume pain without consequence. You believe that being informed is the same as being involved. But knowledge without action is spectatorship. And spectators, too, are part of the system. Every time you say, "It's not my place," every time you say, "What can I do?" every time you say, "I can't look anymore," you are choosing comfort over confrontation. And comfort is how history forgets. So now, as you lie there in the safety of your bed, separated from suffering by nothing but a few walls and glowing screens, ask yourself this. If distance protects your peace, how many horrors are you willing to ignore to keep it intact? When history becomes a commodity, you walk through museums, read plaques, watch documentaries. You say you're learning history, but are you? Or are you just consuming it? Because history today is not a teacher. It's a product, packages, of the past, curated for your comfort. You buy tickets to Auschwitz, snap photos beside crematoriums. You walk through Holocaust museums lit like art galleries. You watch based on a true story war dramas with soundtracks. And in all of this, something crucial is lost. The sting. You no longer feel history. You purchase it. The past has been turned into content. Digestible, profitable. Even horror. There are tours of concentration camps now. Some have cafes, gift shops. You can buy postcards near mass graves. Children reenact Anne Frank's diary for school plays. Online influencers film TikToks from genocide memorials. Not out of malice, out of normalization, we've made memory into merchandise. And in doing so, we have defanged the trauma. Because true history is unbearable. It doesn't fit on a T-shirt dot. It doesn't stream well dot. It won't get good engagement dot. So it's edited dot. The camera cuts before the screaming. The textbook omits the complicity. The speech ends on hope. You leave the museum saying, how powerful, but what did you actually confront? Not the skin peeling off in firebombs, not the smell of charred children, not the silence in a town emptied overnight. No, you saw design. You read quotes. You moved on. And that's the point. When history becomes a commodity, it stops being a warning. It becomes a sedative. You believe you're informed, engaged, educated, but you're being soothed. You're meant to say, how far we've come. You're meant to believe the evil was exceptional. You're meant to feel safe, but the truth is darker. The atrocities you memorialize, they weren't isolated. They were templates. Templates used again and again and again. Cambodia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, Darfur, Myanmar. Each with their own museums, now. Each with their own stories. Merch, tours, and the cycle continues. Because when history is something to be bought, it no longer demands anything from you. Not responsibility, not guilt, not vigilance, not just attention, not just applause, and then nothing. So now, as you lie in your curated world, surrounded by remembered horrors that no longer hurt, ask yourself this. If history has become a product, what happens when you are next on the shelf?